Hello, good to see you again. Hope you're doing okay. It's very hot at the moment. I think it'll probably be still fairly warm by the time you see this video, but it's been that really hot period, and that's, as you'll see later on, one of the things I want to think about a little bit. So, I was thinking about the story of Joseph. I mean, partly because I was once Joseph in the musical of the same name. It's one of those Bible readings in the book of Genesis that has, or not a reading. It's a very long passage that has lots of twists and turns in it. And just sort of mentally to remember the story of Joseph, I just have to kind of go through all the different sort of phases of what happens. Remember his multicolored coat, his betrayal by his brothers who sold him into slavery, all the rest of it. And then, of course, there's the bit when then he's in Egypt, and first of all, he's in great favor with Pharaoh, but then there's a bit of trouble with Pharaoh's wife. He falls out of favor and he ends up in prison. And that's the bit I was thinking about because then there's the famine, and there's the well, it's not, it's before the famine, but there's the dream, the question of interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, and what the dream is about. The sort of seven fat years and seven lean years are, of course, about Joseph being the only one of the diviners who can interpret the king's dream and understand that that's what it's about. There's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and so the good, responsible kind of economic policy is to make sure that you store enough stuff in the good years to see you through the lean years. And then, of course, at the end of that, that's what transpires. That what means that Joseph becomes a great man in the land again, and enables Egypt to see out the famine. And then, of course, what happens is that then other nations who haven't had a Joseph are all sort of starving, and so then that puts Egypt in a strong position. People have to come to them very much as supplicants to sort of get the grain and the food that they've stored to buy at a presumably a fair profit for the Egyptians. And that's, of course, when the other brothers, etc., come back and then finally get to recognize Joseph and have that kind of reconciliation. So, yes, it's a story with lots of twists and turns. The reason I was thinking about it was thinking about the sort of um, ancient things, which problems which sort of face humanity, and the more modern ones, and thinking how they are different. And of course, famine is a great one in the ancient world. I mean, you're always scared of famine, and without sort of a lot of understanding of farming and other sort of what might be causing a failed harvest. Of course, you're always slightly feel you're at the mercy of the gods, and inverted commas. And I suppose it's one of the three great sort of worries of the ancient world. If you're living, you're worried about war, you're worried about famine, and you're worried about plague. And what it seems to me is each of those is that they're likely to affect a certain people. Um, you know, you might be left alone, or you might find yourself in the middle of the war. It was just luck of the draw. You might be in a place where there's a famine, or it might be that you're in a place where it's plentiful and the crops have done well. Even with plague, which, and we'll still think about that now with the pandemic. I mean, plagues in those days were much more localized. I mean, yes, they would have spread through big cities like wildfire, but of course, the lack of travel and the more kind of concrete the physical barriers were. Now, I mean, I know these things did, and sometimes plague sweeps across Europe, but not at the rate that a pandemic does. Because now literally a matter of days, people can be flying all over the world, and that's one of the things that we saw, that it was impossible to contain. And so I was thinking about the fact that, yeah, it must have felt very much in the ancient world as though life was very much in the hands of the gods. It very much was luck of the draw, particularly about those things that one didn't know any better. And so then I was thinking about sort of more modern day. problems. Now, I know you might not believe me, but I mean, the facts and statistics bear this out. I mean, over the last few decades, the world has become more peaceful and more affluent. Now, as I say, I know you won't believe that reading newspapers, because yes, there are always sort of awful wars, there's awful famines, etc. going on. But actually, the trend has been quite markedly away from those things. As I say, the world is simply more peaceful and more affluent, which is a good thing, and sometimes we just ought to remember that over the past few decades. But along with that, it does mean that there are now, I think, different sorts of problems which face humanity. Um, and the pandemic is a very obvious example. And as I say, one of the features of this pandemic, which is probably rather different from plague, is the ease and the speed with which it spreads. I mean, particularly considering, all the sort of medical knowledge we've got, and how medicine has done marvelous things, but in some respects is unable to sort of contain a pandemic. It's got to have other sort of non-medical measures. And then there are other things in the news at the moment. So again, I was thinking about this because it's simply so hot at the moment. Climate change is back in the news now. I mean, 1 or 2 hot days. We were, that's not unusual. But I mean, looking at patterns, it does seem that we are looking at quite significant climate change. And then might look at another thing that I thought of last week, which was sort of pollution, and particularly plastic pollution in the oceans, but all sorts of pollutions around the world. And it seems to me, with these things, as we move from sort of ancient to more present day worries, these are things that are just much more global in nature, and therefore need a combined response. We can't fight climate change as an individual nation. We would make a small difference. We can't fight the pandemic kind of alone. We can't. It's obviously each nation needs to take its part in things like sort of controlling pollution and plastic waste. But we know that actually, again, we can't do it alone. The only way we're going to sort of really put these things right is a global response. And then also because it sort of, we would globally suffer. I mean, even if we stopped using plastic utterly in this country, the results of plastic pollution in the oceans would still, we would still suffer from that as much as anybody else. And it's something that sort of struck me about, at the beginning of the pandemic, where people were talking about sort of the Blitz spirit. And I thought, well, trouble is that, in the Blitz, there's an identifiable enemy, and what was called for and what people saw was, personal heroism. And of course, with a pandemic, there's you can't really do that. There's not an enemy that you can see and identify. It's this thing, and really all you can do is, rather than be heroic, is kind of just abide by the restrictions and just be careful as you go about your business. And so I did sort of think about the nature of these things being different. And then also thought about the worry, I think, for me, that some of the big institutions that might, some international institutions, have kind of, suffered in terms of their reputation. We're perhaps leave the European Union alone, but if we look at things like United Nations, World Health Organization, etc., that as we look at these things, they are seen as these sort of rather cumbersome, perhaps corruption-tainted bureaucracies that are really difficult to turn around, or it's very difficult to get anything done, etc. And the Church of England is much the same in that it feels a bit like in the Church of England, when you look at the worldwide Anglican Communion and all the sort of shenanigans that go on about organising a Lambeth conference and all that sort of thing, all the delicate issues that have to be handled there. It seems, the least attractive part of sort of church life, in a sense, is that kind of international cooperation. But I suppose then that means I want to kind of speak up for those organisations, because I think, in a sense, without being too sort of fatalist about it, it always happens. The League of Nations became discredited, and so then we had the United Nations. We know, yes, it's a cumbersome democracy. We know there's waste. We know it's very difficult things done. We look at the World Health Organization. We look at other organizations that are sort of multinational. They kind of all suffer from this sort of thing, and there is always a kind of, and it's quite right, a bit like the Reformation in Europe in the 16th century. I mean, everybody knew that the kind of church needed Reformation. It's just kind of nobody could quite agree how to do it. And I think that's the same with these organizations. I think it's great to be zealous for change, for streamlining them, for making sure they can act and decisions happen quickly and effectively. I mean, I think that's all great. I think what you can't do, and what you sometimes I now see happening, is people sort of say, abandoning them and say, oh, they're rubbish, can't do anything, because there's no alternative. I mean, that's the trouble. We are faced by these huge global challenges. The nations are going to have to work together, whether we like it or not, if we're going to tackle them, and we're going to have to use these huge multinational, international agencies of cooperation to do so. Otherwise, we are lost. So, as I say, it just strikes me that this is perhaps really relevant to the modern world more than the ancient world that the Bible was written in. That we are going to have to find a way as nations to cooperate together to tackle these big global challenges. And I know that we are frustrated, and quite rightly frustrated, with some of the mechanisms and the bureaucracy that goes with it. And quite rightly, we want to make these institutions better and more streamlined and more effective and more able to take decisions and more democratically accountable. No problem with that at all. And that's great. But what we can't do is rubbish them. What we can't do is abandon them and put nothing in their place. Because with these global problems, we need global solutions.